welcome to Afflictions Sugarcoated, a podcast where we sugarcoat some of the world's so-called afflictions and rate their plausibility on a scale of 1 to 5. I'm Minnie Kim, and today we'll be sugarcoating the Pine Island Glacier. So I recently read about this story on the New York Times about something called a Pine Island Glacier, and the hook essentially is this. A few weeks ago, a research ship in Antarctica sailed into a place no human has ever seen before, a 20-mile-long inlet that used to be solid ice, and the scientists on board called it a death trap because icebergs were constantly breaking off. The only exit could close at any moment and it could essentially trap you. And less than 10 years ago, this entire stretch of ocean didn't exist. The inlet now exists because Pine Island Glacier's floating ice shelf collapsed between 2017 and 2020, and the ship called the Aeron is literally sailing through the space where a glacier used to be. And the glacier is thinning, cracking, and accelerating into the sea. And the main thing of note here is, of course, this is not a movie. This is January 2026. This is not just a story about Antarctica. It's a story about how climate change actually looks like when it stops being just a graph and starts being about geography and how the literal geography of the Earth is changing. And that starts where it's most visible, Antarctica, but it ends towards some place that's usually visible to the average person, such as snow that is missing in northern New England during January. It looks like warm weather. It looks like harsher climate during every single season, and it got me thinking about a dinner that I had with the principal of my school just a couple of days ago, and it was obviously it was a talk between the two political parties on campus where we kind of get together, bridge the divide between the two, and share our thoughts on, the current political climate, other futures of each party, and most importantly, it always ends on something called a climate change. And whenever someone brings up climate change, I wonder why it's been politicized so much. I mean, there are clearly reasons why it has been so, but most of all, it's a bit iffy. For example, if you're someone who's a strong advocate of, trying to work towards a solution or at least some kind of remedial measure for climate change, you would jump at the chance. But if I were to hear something about climate change, I don't know why. Some part of my brain immediately goes to the fact that this conversation is about to be an annoying one. And perhaps that's where the problem lies. We were talking about in the dinner how climate change is a collective action problem, how politics mainly cannot fix it because politics is one of the most deterring factors of climate change after all. I mean, it's the lobbying, it's the fact that people are willing to spend or spread any kind of news about how certain degrees of climate change did not actually cause that wildfire or natural disaster, and people are willing to feed into that system because they want to believe that something other than their climate is failing. And that is a sad reality that we try to grapple with every time it comes up on the news. We think about it for 10 seconds and then it leaves our mind. And I don't know, maybe I wanted this to last in people's minds than more than 10 seconds. To preface this, I wouldn't call myself a very avid climate change activist. I rarely think about it, no matter how negligent or bad that may seem to the average person. But when you really think back, towards, I don't know, last week, unless you are that one really avid climate change activist that we all know in our lives, you rarely thought about climate change. You thought, huh, January is supposed to be a bit chillier than this. Or you thought, huh, there's that ice cap in Antarctica that's melting, according to the New York Times. You maybe even saw a movie or a piece of Instagram reel, YouTube, TikTok, anything like that. Never stuck in your mind as to how do I reduce my single carbon footprint. And even if you did, you probably thought, what difference could I make? Now, I just want to briefly talk about the history of climate change because it is indeed worth talking about how we came to this state of the planet. I'm just trying to bring some more attention to this after reading that one New York Times article. Although the article was not supposed to highlight climate change so much so as it was supposed to highlight the scientific discovery, but that's just what my mind went to. So, what climate change actually is, there is pretty much a clear, non boring explanation to that. Climate change is a long term shift in Earth's temperature and weather patterns, and global warming is the temperature part of climate change. So that is going to be separate from the other, but the two often go together. But there is some importance in them not being conflated. The basic mechanism is that the sun sends energy to the earth, and the earth reflects some of it back. But there are things that you probably heard of as greenhouse gases, which include CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, that trap some of that heat. And this is normally a good thing. Without it, the Earth would be completely frozen and life could not exist. But the problem is that humans are supercharging this effect. Since the 1750s, when the Industrial Revolution really started getting its boom, we started burning coal, oil, and gas. We cut forests. We added enormous amounts of CO2 to the atmosphere, and CO2 trapped heat for centuries. And when I say we burn coal, oil, and gas, I do not mean that in the status quo. You see the latest news with Venezuela, although an argument can be made that the US is just trying to use that oil in the most ethical way possible in comparison to its other global superpower counterparts, such as China or Russia. The analogy here is that climate change is like putting thicker blankets on the planet and then acting surprised when it starts to overheat. And how we got here may be a bit intuitive, and it probably is when I think of it in less difficult terms. The fact that we just wanted more things, and that had an impact on the Earth. But in terms of the pre industrial Earth, we do know that climate did change slowly over thousands to millions of years. There were ice ages, warm periods, etc., but they were mostly gradual. The real boom when the Industrial Revolution happened in the late 1700s to the 1800s, there were coal powered factories, there were steam engines, then there was oil and gas, and CO2 levels begin rising fast. And that is a distinctly different thing from gradual climate change. And then we have the 20th century acceleration when we made cars, planes, electricity, plastics, mass deforestation, and there was a population boom. So even if the things that we used never increased, the amount of people who used it increased. And then we have the great acceleration post 1950 when CO2 rise became near vertical. There was global temperatures that were clearly starting to rise, so it was the tipping point, and glaciers started retreating worldwide. The climate didn't slowly drift into danger. The evidence does show that we were a huge part of it. And I guess that kind of gets rid of any ideology that is stuck in the back of your minds, baby, that say, "Ooh, the climate was changing all the time." I mean, you hear the ice ages. But this is different. It is a very clear correlation between what we have done to the climate. Essentially, the science behind the article as to why ice is the canary in the coal mine is that, well, let's just say that the ice sheets are in Greenland or Antarctica. It holds enough water to raise sea levels by approximately 65 meters, and they act like planetary mirrors, and they reflect a lot of sunlight. And when they melt, yes, sea levels rise. That's the most baseline thing. But dark oceans also absorb more heat, and the warming only accelerates. So it's a constant cycle. So, why does Pine Island, the thing that I mentioned before in the New York Times, even matter? Because Pine Island are being eaten from below by warm ocean currents, and it has lost more ice than Thwaites in the past 50 years. So when Pine Island's floating shelf collapsed, it was completely unexpected, as one of the writers in the New York Times puts it. The floating ice shelves act like corks in a bottle, and when they break, the glaciers behind them start flowing into the ocean much faster. And that's exactly what the scientists in the article are seeing right now. The ship sailed into a new ocean space. Icebergs are constantly breaking off. Entrances could close at any moment. The seafloor is not fully mapped. We are unaware of how pretty much the vast majority of seafloor look like. And a huge iceberg has sealed the entrance just weeks earlier. They weren't exploring the unknown, they were just measuring something that used to exist that does not anymore. And it doesn't exist anymore because of climate change, because it melted. I personally don't feel like there is a need to mention why this is so important, as in why this isn't just an Antarctic problem. It seems very intuitive, but what I've realized is people need to internalize it because melting ice means sea levels rise, which means flooded coastal cities, climate refugees, saltwater intrusion into farmland, stronger storms. I mean, even a small increase, as in zero point 0.5 meters, means that tens of millions of people are displaced. 1 meter means that many major cities are partially lost. That is the amount that we are going by. It's a very thin line. It's a very thin ice scape, if you will. So it's not just going to be the ice. It's going to be heat waves. It's going to be droughts, wildfires, stronger hurricanes, ecosystems collapsing, and crops failing. I mean, when I was having this conversation at the dinner table, one of the teachers mentioned when I said that people need a visceral gut impact to see that climate change is actually a thing and that they need to do something about it. He said, "Well, don't you see the California wildfires just a year ago during the summer? Don't you see that people have been injured, some have been killed, houses have been destroyed?" In order to realize that a lot of it is happening right in front of our faces. And when I say our faces, I mean the people privileged enough to listen to this podcast in the first place, not the people being displaced by so many of these incidents. And then there are people who claim that the two cannot be correlated, that science cannot correlate those two. But even so, we have recognized that there is a problem, and to ignore that problem solely based on this idea that it's not correlated, that sounds like a very huge deal of an escape to me. The stability of the climate has allowed us to do many things in the past. It has allowed us to create cities, farming. It has made civilization literally possible, and we are pushing the earth into a climate state that no human society has ever lived in. It feels very slow, but it isn't, because stress is building in a glacier, cracks are invisible for years, and then suddenly there is a collapse and acceleration, irreversibility, and we hear it about it in the news, like I just read this New York Times article, but we forget about it. Like, I will forget about this episode of this podcast probably tomorrow morning when I wake up. Because although it was completely unexpected, suddenly a 20-mile ocean exists where ice used to be. Because somewhere in America, a small metal instrument is drifting under collapsing ice and trying to measure how warm the water is before it melts even more of a glacier that used to hold back the sea. And that might be the honest image of our species right now. It's rushing to measure what we're just pretending to have time to stop, essentially. I think that's tragic. But as I mentioned before, there's the collective action problem. And this problem is a lot more serious than climate change itself, in my opinion. Because one man's turning off the lights, one man's recycling properly, one man's use of the bike instead of the car may not seem like it does much. And to be frank, it does absolutely nothing. And that's not to discourage any people, it's just that in the state of the world, there is no way that it compares to even the most minuscule amount than, oil companies or um, other fossil fuel activities, other CO2 emissions that are happening on a much larger scale for very important things that we can't just cut off because of this idea of climate change. So we push them off. We push them off into politics. We push off the burden into politicians. We push off the burdens into big tech. Even nowadays, we still think that Elon Musk will think of something very grand to solve all of our problems. And we think of anyone else, anyone bigger than our individual selves to fix this problem that is much more than just a person, certainly much more than a country, which, by the way, is another part of this huge collective action problem. When I'm voting for someone in office in Korea or the United States, my main concern is not climate change, not because I don't care about it, but because I trust other countries to fix it. I don't think it weighs above my burden for, I don't know, inflation, taxes, healthcare, all of those things. So I put them at the beginning of my need. And that is very valid. In fact, it's probably the most valid choice for your children and for your parents. So I guess what this rant has led me to is the fact that there is an issue of pushing climate change towards the unseeable, although we can see it right in front of us. We are kicking the can down the road. I don't think that this podcast will do anything revolutionary about it. There's already been quite a few activists that have taken that or job for me, and still there is much work to be done, or else this earth might actually be doomed. I choose, for at least the hopes of everyone listening to this podcast, that there is indeed hope, that there is indeed a solution for us, even though it isn't going to be one piece of technology or one sudden ice age that fixes all of our problems. I hope, and I certainly hope that all people do is just talk about climate change like I am doing now. And I bear the weight of this mistake too. The fact that I'm willing to talk and talk about it when no action is being fulfilled by my one individual voice. In fact, it would be much more diligent of me to take the bike instead of doing this one spiel on climate change. But in the hopes that there will be a future on the earth and in the hopes that people will receive the same message as I did in the Pine Island Glacier piece from the New York Times. Not just that it was a scientific discovery, but also a knock at climate change, and to the hopes that a lot of people will start voting for people who care much more deeply about this issue, because if not, there might be an end to this. Not to be nihilistic. I give the sugarcoating of climate change and the Pine Island Glacier story a 2. This podcast was written and produced by me, Minnie Kim. If you have any comments or reviews, please feel free to write any and all thoughts in your podcast reviews. If you'd like to suggest an affliction for me to sugarcoat, please email me via afflictionssugarcoated@gmail.com. I sincerely thank you for listening to this podcast, no matter how depressing it might have been, and I hope that, yes, your one individual action cannot change anything. I think there needs to be a change. You probably do too, but again, thinking or talking does not change anything at all. So I guess there really is no solution to this other than a revolutionary invention or a revolutionary idea. And I hope that comes really soon. And I hope that you recognize as you're listening to this podcast that my hope is adding on to the collective action problem. And with that, I will leave you to think about climate change for another couple of minutes, or maybe even the next day, until you have much busier things to attend in your life. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll talk to you next month.